There is a photograph that most people have never seen. A yellow net. Stretched between two concrete buildings. Hanging maybe 30 feet above the ground. It was not there to catch falling equipment. It was not a construction safety measure. It was installed to catch people who jumped from the windows above it. And the building it surrounded was not a prison. It was a factory. This is the story of Foxconn. A company most people have never heard of, even though they almost certainly own something it built. Foxconn is a Taiwanese electronics manufacturer. And for the past 2 decades, it has been responsible for assembling a significant portion of the world's consumer technology. Smartphones. Laptops. Tablets. Gaming consoles. If you own a modern device, there is a reasonable chance it passed through one of their facilities. That part of the story is not particularly controversial. What happened inside those facilities is a different matter entirely. To understand what Foxconn actually was at its peak, you have to understand the scale. These were not factories in the traditional sense. They were cities. The Longhua campus in Shenzhen, China, covered nearly 3 square kilometers. It had its own roads, its own bus system, its own hospitals, its own supermarkets, its own banks. At its largest, it housed somewhere between 230,000 and 450,000 workers depending on the season and production cycle. To put that in context, that is larger than the population of Pittsburgh. All of them, living and working inside a single compound. Built around a single purpose. For global technology companies, Foxconn was remarkable. Products could be designed in California, components sourced from across Asia, and final assembly completed in China at a speed and cost that no competitor could match. Executives praised the efficiency. Consumers enjoyed the products. Investors watched the margins. Almost nobody paid close attention to the workers. Inside the factories, the work was repetitive in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe. Workers performed the same physical motion, sometimes thousands of times, in a single shift. Attaching a single component. Tightening a single screw. Inspecting a single surface. Over and over, for shifts that regularly stretched to 10, 12, sometimes 16 hours during peak production periods. Workers lived in company dormitories a short walk from the assembly floor. They ate in company cafeterias. They woke up, worked, slept, and woke up again, inside the same walls, on the same schedule, surrounded by the same people doing the same things. For many workers, particularly those who had migrated from rural provinces hundreds of miles away, the isolation was severe. They were surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people. And many of them were profoundly alone. In 2010, workers began dying. Not from accidents on the production floor. Not from industrial hazards. They were falling from the buildings. The first death drew some attention. The second drew more. By the time the number reached double digits within a single year, it was impossible to ignore. Journalists arrived. Labor organizations began investigating. International media started asking questions that the company and its clients had not prepared to answer. What exactly was happening inside these facilities? The picture that emerged was not a simple one. Workers described management systems built on strict discipline, public criticism for errors, and relentless pressure to meet production targets that increased rather than stabilized over time. Investigators documented a culture where the psychological cost of the work was treated as irrelevant, an acceptable variable in the equation of manufacturing efficiency. Many of the workers were in their late teens or early 20s. Some had never lived away from their families before. They had come looking for a wage that would help support parents and siblings back home. What they found was an environment that left very little room for anything else. Foxconn responded to the crisis in several ways. They increased wages. They brought in counselors. They worked with outside auditors. They held group sessions where workers were asked to sign pledges stating they would not harm themselves. And they installed the nets. The nets became the image the world remembered. Not because they were the worst thing that happened inside those facilities, but because of what they represented. When a company's primary response to workers dying is to install a physical barrier around the building, the message that sends is difficult to interpret any other way. The problem was not being solved. It was being contained. At the same time all of this was unfolding, something else was happening. The products being assembled inside those facilities were launching to global celebration. Lines wrapped around city blocks. Reviews described them as revolutionary. Advertisements spoke about creativity, connection, and the human spirit. The contrast was uncomfortable in a way that most people chose not to sit with for very long. Over time, pressure from media, labor groups, and some client companies did produce changes inside Foxconn facilities. Wages increased. Some conditions improved. Oversight became more visible. But the fundamental structure of the operation remained largely intact. And as public attention moved on to other stories, the scrutiny faded. New products launched. New campaigns ran. New lines formed outside stores. What makes the Foxconn story genuinely difficult is that it does not have a clear villain. There is no single person who designed the system with the intention of causing harm. There is no obvious moment where someone made a deliberate decision to sacrifice workers. Instead, what happened was the result of accumulated decisions made by thousands of people across dozens of companies and multiple governments, each of whom was operating rationally within a system that rewarded efficiency above nearly everything else. The workers were not invisible because anyone decided to hide them. They were invisible because the system worked better when nobody looked. That photograph of the yellow net was taken more than a decade ago. The factories are still running. The products are still shipping. And right now, somewhere on the other side of the world, in a building most people will never see, someone is performing the same motion for the 10,000th time today. Attaching a component. Tightening a screw. Building something that will eventually end up in someone's pocket. Someone who will probably never think about where it came from.